Did women have a chance in medieval society? Was the deck stacked against them from the beginning? When you think about medieval times, you might imagine knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. But the reality for women was far more complicated and troubling. Number 7. UST, the ultimate double standard. Ever wonder why medieval women were always portrayed as either perfect virgins or dangerous temptresses? Nothing threatened medieval social order quite like female sexuality. While men were expected to struggle with lust as a natural consequence of their supposedly stronger passions, women caught in sexual indiscretions faced devastating consequences. A medieval woman labeled as lustful could lose everything: her reputation, family connections, and any hope for a secure future. Church writings from the period frequently depicted women as inherently more susceptible to sexual temptation. Saint Jerome, whose works were widely read throughout the Middle Ages, wrote that woman is the gate of the devil, the path of wickedness, the sting of the serpent. In a word, a perilous object. These weren't just abstract theological concepts. They shaped how communities viewed their mothers, daughters, and sisters. The Madonna whore dichotomy became firmly established during this time. Women were expected to emulate the Virgin Mary's impossible standard of being both a mother and perpetually pure. Meanwhile, figures like Mary Magdalene, incorrectly portrayed as a reformed prostitute in medieval tradition, represented the dangerous female sexuality that needed to be contained. When plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, many religious authorities blamed women's supposed sexual depravity. Records from 1349 show that in some German towns, women suspected of sexual impropriety were executed alongside Jews and foreigners as scapegoats for the Black Death. What made this particularly damaging was the catch-22. Women were simultaneously viewed as more prone to sexual sin while being held to stricter standards of chastity than men. A noblewoman caught in adultery could be imprisoned in a convent for life, while her male partner might escape with a fine. The medieval penitential manuals, guidebooks for priests, hearing confessions, devoted extensive sections to women's sexual sins, prescribing harsher penances than for men committing identical acts. A married woman who committed adultery might be assigned years of fasting and prayer, while her husband's identical transgression could require mere weeks of penance. Number 6. Gluttoning. Beyond just eating too much. Did you know medieval women could be accused of gluttony for simply wanting equal food portions as men? This might seem shocking to modern sensibilities, but medieval attitudes toward food were deeply intertwined with gender expectations. Women's consumption was scrutinized in ways men's never was. Medieval household manuals explicitly stated that women should eat less than men, not just as a matter of portion control, but as a moral obligation. The 13th century text, The Goodman of Paris, advised that proper women should eat soberly little and seldom. Fasting became particularly associated with female piety. Women's saints were celebrated for their extreme food deprivation, creating impossible standards for ordinary women. Saint Catherine of Siena, who eventually died of starvation, was held up as a model of feminine virtues specifically for her refusal to eat beer brewing. Once predominantly women's work in early medieval Europe gradually became controlled by men as it became more profitable. By the late medieval period, women brewers were increasingly portrayed as gluttonous, untrustworthy, and even associated with witchcraft, a clever way to push them out of a lucrative industry. The moral policing of women's appetites extended to pregnancy cravings. Medieval medical texts suggested that a pregnant woman's food desires revealed the moral character of both mother and unborn child. Craving sweet foods supposedly indicated a virtuous baby, while desiring unusual combinations could indicate moral corruption. Food preparation became another battleground. Women were expected to cook for their families, but culinary creativity could raise suspicions. Using exotic spices or unfamiliar techniques might brand a woman as extravagant or indulgent, a form of gluttony by proxy. What made gluttony particularly insidious as a weapon against women was its invisibility. Unlike the dramatic sins of lust or wrath, gluttony's subtle nature made it perfect for constant social control. Every meal became a potential moral test for medieval women. Number 5. Greed. When ambition became a female sin, ever wondered why medieval tales rarely featured women seeking wealth and power? For medieval women, any desire for financial independence could be branded as the deadly sin of greed. Women's property rights were severely limited throughout most of medieval Europe. A married woman's possessions automatically became her husband's upon marriage under the legal principle of coverture. This meant that a woman seeking to control her own finances was effectively committing a moral transgression by defying the natural order. When women did manage to accumulate wealth, it quickly attracted negative attention. Female merchants, though they existed throughout the Middle Ages, were frequently portrayed in popular literature as misers, cheats, or unnaturally masculine. One 14th-century French tale describes a female cloth merchant as having the greed of 10 men in her small body. Inheritance practices systematically favored male heirs. Even noblewomen typically received only a fraction of family wealth compared to their brothers. When women did assert claims to equal inheritance, they were often characterized as avaricious and unnatural, putting personal gain above family harmony. The situation grew worse after the Black Death created labor shortages. As women began filling traditionally male occupations with higher wages, numerous towns passed ordinances specifically limiting female earnings. These weren't framed as economic measures but as moral ones, protecting women from the sin of greed that might corrupt their gentle natures. Religious writings reinforced these attitudes. While male saints could be wealthy merchants or nobles who used their resources for good, female saints were overwhelmingly celebrated for renouncing any claim to wealth. Saint Clare of Assisi, founder of the Poor Clares, was venerated specifically for embracing absolute poverty as the feminine ideal. Women who engaged in money lending, one of the few financial pursuits sometimes available to them, particularly Jewish women, faced dual condemnation, both for the perceived sin of usury and for stepping outside feminine financial passivity. The double standard was striking. A man building wealth was providing for his family, while a woman doing the same was yielding to sinful greed. This effectively prevented most women from achieving financial independence, leaving them perpetually dependent on male relatives or the church. Number 4. Sloth. When women's work was never enough. Medieval society recognized the endless labor of women. The answer might surprise you. The sin of sloth was weaponized against women in particularly insidious ways. While men's work typically had clear boundaries, the fields, the workshop, the marketplace, women's domestic labor was expected to be constant and never complete. The very invisibility of household work made women perpetually vulnerable to accusations of idleness. Medieval household manuals like the Book of the Knight of the Tower emphasized that virtuous women should always keep busy with textile work. Even noble women were expected to spend their leisure hours spinning, embroidering, or weaving, not as creative outlets, but as moral obligations to avoid idleness. A woman resting might be accused of the deadly sin of sloth, even after completing exhausting household tasks. As one 14th-century sermon put it, the devil finds work for idle hands, but doubly so for women's idle hands, which are weaker vessels more easily turned to sin. The double standard was stark. A man could rest after his day's work without moral condemnation, but a woman sitting idle was potentially committing a deadly sin. Records from manor courts show women being fined for wasting time in gossip, even when their household duties were complete. After childbirth, medieval women were typically granted a lying-in period of rest, lasting about a month. Yet even this necessary recovery became morally suspect, with church authorities warning against excessively long confinements as invitations to slothful habit. Some parishes recorded women returning to full household duties mere days after giving birth, likely fearing moral censure. Women's religious devotions weren't exempt from this scrutiny. While male contemplative prayer was respected, women who spent too much time in prayer could be accused of neglecting their household duties, essentially making piety itself a form of female sloth. The ultimate catch. 22 emerged around women's education. Reading was considered dangerously idle for women, potentially leading to moral corruption through inappropriate stories. Yet, the alternative needlework and household management provided no opportunity for intellectual growth. Either choice could be framed as a moral failing. What made this particularly effective as a control mechanism was its unwinnable nature. No amount of female industry could definitively prove a woman wasn't slothful, because the next day brought the same endless expectations with no final accomplishment to point to. Number 3, WRAT. When women weren't allowed to be angry. Was a woman ever justified in showing anger in medieval society? The historical record suggests this was rarely acceptable. While male anger could be seen as righteous indignation or necessary for maintaining household order, female anger was categorically viewed as a manifestation of the deadly sin of wrath. Church writings frequently associated women's anger with irrationality, spiritual weakness, and even demonic influence. This created a suffocating double bind for women facing genuine injustices. A woman who expressed anger about mistreatment could find herself labeled wrathful and therefore deserving of further correction. Medieval court records show numerous cases where women's complaints about domestic violence were dismissed because the women showed unseemly passion in their testimonies. Medical texts from the period reinforced these attitudes by claiming women were physiologically prone to emotional excess due to their cold and wet humoral nature. The influential 13th century encyclopedia on the properties of things stated that women's physical makeup made them more jealous than men, more garrulous, and more wrathful when provoked. The suppression of female anger had real-world consequences. Women who displayed anger in public could face community censure, including humiliating punishments like the scold's bridle, a metal cage locked around the head with a plate that pressed down on the tongue, preventing speech. Court records from 15th century England document women being forced to wear these devices through town for offenses as minor as arguing with neighbors. Literary representations further reinforced these norms. While male literary heroes could righteously vanquish enemies in anger, female characters who showed anger typically ended their stories humbled, married off, or dead. Chaucer's Wife of Bath, though presented with some sympathy, ultimately reinforces the message that female assertiveness must be tamed. Religious instruction intensified these pressures. The virtue of patience was particularly emphasized in sermons directed at women. As one 14th century preacher put it, "A woman's crown is her patience in suffering, for in this she most resembles the Virgin Mother." Even women with legitimate authority faced these constraints. Female rulers like Eleanor of Aquitaine discovered that necessary assertiveness could be quickly reframed as unwomanly wrath, undermining their political position. Chronicles describing Eleanor's actions use language of emotional excess, absent from descriptions of kings taking identical measures. The lasting impact of this prohibition extended beyond individual psychology to women's collective ability to advocate for themselves. By categorizing righteous female anger as the deadly sin of wrath, medieval society effectively neutralized a powerful tool for resisting oppression. Number 2. Envy, the sin that turned women against each other. Have you ever wondered how medieval society managed to control half its population with relatively limited resources? The answer might lie in how women were encouraged to police each other. The deadly sin of envy was uniquely weaponized against women by suggesting they were naturally more prone to jealousy than men. This created a self-policing system where women monitored and reported other women's behavior, effectively turning potential allies into adversaries. Medieval sermons frequently warned women against envying other women's beauty, husbands, or social standing. These weren't just spiritual warnings. They created a culture where women's natural human feelings could be interpreted as moral failings, making them constantly vulnerable to accusations. Beauty standards became a particularly effective battlefield for fostering female envy, with a woman's marriage prospects and social standing often dependent on her appearance. The stage was set for devastating competition. Church writings complicated this further by simultaneously warning against both vanity and the envy of others' beauty. Another unwinnable situation for medieval women. Court records reveal how effectively this worked in practice. In many medieval witch trials, the initial accusations came from other women. Analysis of 16th century German witch trials shows that women accused other women in approximately 65% of cases, often following disputes over status, property, or male attention. Female-dominated spaces like the birthing room became sites of intense scrutiny. Midwives occupied a precarious position, respected for their knowledge, but vulnerable to accusations of envy-driven malice if births went wrong. Records from 15th century Italian cities document midwives being accused of harming infants out of jealousy toward the mother's social position or fertility. The limited pathways to female power made envy particularly destructive. With few routes to security besides advantageous marriage, women were effectively forced into competition with one another for the limited resource of eligible men. This wasn't a natural state, but one carefully maintained by inheritance laws and occupational restrictions. Religious imagery reinforced these divisions. Eve's envy of God's knowledge was frequently cited as the original female sin, suggesting women's jealousy had cosmic significance. By contrast, the Virgin Mary's perfect contentment with her humble state was presented as the impossible standard women should aspire to. What made envy particularly effective as a control mechanism was how it prevented collective action. Women who might have found common cause against systemic injustices were instead encouraged to view each other with suspicion and resentment. When combined with restrictions on female gathering and speech, this effectively neutralized half the population as a potential source of social resistance. Number 1. Pride, the ultimate female transgression. Could a medieval woman ever take pride in her accomplishments? Was self-confidence itself a sin for women? Of all 7 deadly sins, pride was perhaps the most comprehensively deployed against women. While men could take rightful pride in their achievements, lineage, and abilities, women's pride was almost universally condemned as a spiritual danger. The very definition of female virtue centered on humility. Religious texts, like the Ancren Wisse, a 13th century guide for female anchorites, devoted entire sections to the dangers of female pride, warning that pride makes angels into devils, humility makes women into angels. Similar warnings for male readers were notably less emphatic. Beauty routines, necessary for women's social standing, became moral minefields. A woman who took too much care with her appearance committed the sin of pride, but one who neglected her looks failed in her social duties. This impossible balance kept women in perpetual insecurity. Intellectual accomplishments became particularly dangerous territory. Female scholars like Hildegard of Bingen had to preface their works with elaborate disclaimers about their unworthiness and weakness, as these weren't mere literary conventions, but essential shields against accusations of intellectual pride. Even motherhood, the most celebrated female role, was fraught with pride-related dangers. A woman who appeared too confident in her parenting could be accused of the deadly sin of pride, while one who struggled might be deemed naturally inadequate. Chronicles and saints' lives frequently feature cautionary tales of mothers punished for excessively praising their children. Women who succeeded in business faced similar challenges. Female guild members and merchants had to carefully present their success as luck or divine favor rather than personal skill, a constraint their male counterparts didn't share. Court records from 15th century London show female brewers and silkworkers being specifically cited for excessive pride in business disputes where male pride went unmentioned. Pride's connection to female speech was particularly restrictive. Women who spoke with authority, especially on religious or intellectual matters, risked accusations of prideful behavior. The 15th century trial records of Marjorie Kempe reveal how her confident religious pronouncements were repeatedly characterized as sinful pride by male church authorities. The deadly sin of pride effectively created a ceiling on female achievement. Any woman who excelled too visibly risked not just social condemnation but the far more serious accusation of spiritual corruption. This transformed natural human satisfaction in accomplishment into something dangerous and forbidden specifically for women. What makes the medieval deployment of deadly sins against women particularly noteworthy isn't just historical interest. It's the echoes that remain in contemporary attitudes. How many of these patterns still shape our judgments today? When we label women as difficult, high maintenance, or bossy, are we continuing traditions with very deep roots? Are these ancient moral frameworks still influencing how we think about women's behavior today?